I would like to welcome you to the LSE if you're coming from outside to this lecture, which is hosted by the Department of Sociology at LSE. Tonight, our speaker is Professor Mirsepassi, and the title of his lecture will be The Human Sciences on Trial in Iran. The lecture will last for about 45 minutes, and we hope to leave a substantial amount of time, about half an hour, for question and answers. There will be a reception following the event. All members of the audience are very welcome to attend that. To give you some information about Professor Mirsepassi, to many of you he will be known. Professor Mirsepassi teaches Middle Eastern Studies and Sociology at New York University. He's the director of the Iranian Studies Initiative as well, also at NYU. He is currently a visiting professor in the Department of Sociology at LSE. Among other books, Professor Mirsepassi is the author of Political Islam, Iran and Enlightenment, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. Also, Democracy in Modern Iran, which was published by New York University Press in 2010. Intellectual Discourses and Politics of Modernization, Negotiating Modernity in Iran, which was published by Cambridge University Press in the year 2000. And he's also the editor of a number of volumes and the author of Truth and Democracy, which was published in Iran in 1999. Professor Mirsepassi's latest book is forthcoming in December 2013 by Cambridge University Press. It is co-authored with Khordad Front and is titled Islam, Democracy and Cosmopolitanism at Home in the World. Before Professor Mirsepassi begins his lecture, I'd like to make a few announcements. One is that, please, may I remind the audience to turn your phones to silent. We don't want to disrupt the event. Also, if you'd like to tweet about this event, our hashtag is LSE Iran. It should be on there. LSE Iran is the hashtag. We hope that a podcast of the event will be available very soon online if every technicality goes well, which is not to be trusted all the time. But this event is going to be recorded for your information. Before further ado, I would like to welcome Professor Mirsepassi, and thank you very much for this lecture.
Thank you, Professor Çubukçu, for your very gracious introduction. And I would like to thank you and welcome all of you for taking time and coming here this evening. And I am very happy to be able to share my thoughts with you tonight. Okay. What I have decided to share with you tonight is a rather ambitious project that I hope I can accomplish in 45 minutes because it will touch upon several interrelated but very complex issues regarding the process of social change in Iran in the past 3 decades, or maybe even more. The focus or the center of my talk is in the title, which refers to a series of events in the aftermath of the presidential elections of 2009 in Iran. I just assume that you know the details and don't want to go into explaining the events, but this was the second term of President Ahmadinejad's election. The election process was going actually very slow, and the predictions even 2 months before the election was that this would be a non-eventful election. But then, from my perspective, partly because it was decided that the major presidential candidates would debate on national TV. For the first time in the history of Iranian election processes, it was decided that I believe 4 candidates would debate each other one-on-one on Iranian state-run national TV. And as a result of these debates, and other issues too, but I believe to a large extent, because Ahmadinejad was challenged by all other 3 candidates for not being truthful, for not being a thinking kind of person, and for being dishonest and unethical. I think Iranian, at a very mass level, were mobilized. And I remember one day I called my mom, and he said, Ali, the situation in Tehran at least looks like the days of revolution in the 78. So there was a massive social, peaceful and very non-violent. There was very little incidents. Sometimes the right-wing groups would attack other candidates, but mostly a very peaceful process, but very massive on scale. That I don't think we ever seen in any election processes in Iran. The voting happened on a Friday in June, but immediately after the polls were closed, it was announced by Interior Minister that Ahmadinejad won by a landslide, 60+%. And people were shocked. And there were I would say, spontaneous mass demonstrations. And again, these demonstrations were peaceful demonstrations, but they were extremely powerful because of the size of demonstrations. On some days, we had 2-3 millions in Tehran demonstrating, but of course, people demonstrating all over, certainly in major cities. And the demands of the demonstrators were very basic and simple. The main demand was, where is my vote? And basically people were furious and felt that this was a fraud election. And all the candidates, the main candidate, former President Mousavi, but also the conservative candidate too, actively argued that the numbers do not add up, and everybody pointed to many discrepancies and problems with the votings. The post-election protest movement became basically a social movement of a mass scale, unprecedented in post-revolution. The only mass demonstrations that I can identify as being in the same kind of scale were some of the demonstrations that led to the revolution of 78-79. The state responds to demands of people for recounting the votes and irregularities in the election was very interesting. First of all, the day after the election, hundreds of what the state perceived as leaders of the protest movement were arrested. Many of these people were arrested before there were demonstrations. And it was clear that there was some kind of plan to contain and control and limit the activities of certain individuals. And now I have to go to the next. And Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader of Iran, I would argue for the first time, came out and personally and in a very public and visible way led the process of suppressing and containing the protest movement. He basically, on a Friday prayer speech, basically announced that from tomorrow, the following Saturday, there should be no demonstrations. No one should speak of election fraud, and anybody who would commit treason, and it would be illegal, and basically invited the security forces and the Revolutionary Guards to deal with any opposition from that day on. The reality was that by this time, hundreds of people were already arrested. And of course, after that day, thousands and thousands of people were arrested, mistreated, killed, and the whole process went on for about 8 months. Of course, after a while, a process that started as a protest against election became known as the Green Movement, for those of us who supported that democratic movement, and the state and Ayatollah Khomeini labeled it as a fitna, which I want to come back at some point and explain what he meant by fitna. So this is a little background. But what was very interesting, and in some respect to many puzzling, was a massive mobilization of state resources and institutions immediately after the election to blame what in Iran is called human sciences, and here in the West we call it social sciences, to blame social scientists as individuals, social science institutions, particularly two departments at Tehran University. If I can go back. Oh. So the picture you see, the sort of the building, that is the Faculty of Law and Political Science. Members of the faculty and that institutions was blamed for the unrest, and also another university institutions, where the sociology department is based. These two departments were blamed, and professors and students who are studying human sciences were accused of inciting revolt and unrest and committing acts of treason. But it went even further than that, and ideas of social sciences were the state media, TV and radio, newspapers and magazines Friday prayers, or every imaginable public space that government had, which is huge in Iran, were used and utilized to condemn and maybe criticize, but to blame the ideas, institutions, and individuals who are involved in social sciences as inciting the fitna. And the Green Movement, in a sense, was identified with what is wrong with what in Iran is called human sciences in Iran. So, and this is what I would like to discuss tonight with you, and try to explain from my own point of view, is that why is it that in a really mainly political event or dispute about elections, among basically several factions of the government, by the way, the main oppositional candidate was a former prime minister. Mousavi was former prime minister of Iran for 8 years during the war, as were others, other candidates. This was not a kind of velvet elections or revolutions in Eastern Europe of like non-communists challenging communists. These were all committed Muslim believers who also believed in the Islamic Republic, but had difference of policies. In fact, in the debates on TV, debates were really focused mainly, apart from certain ethical and implying that Ahmadinejad may not be a stable person, which was personal, was on public policy, on matters of policy. So, what I want to propose, and at this point I just propose it, and then I want to come back to this, is that this has to do with the nature of truth, the state and citizens, and the everyday life. I think to understand why, in the aftermath of such a huge, massive social protest movements, so much of the state resources was mobilized to target and harass social scientists and ideas that comes from social sciences and universities and so on and so forth, and continued and is continuing, I would say, up to today, has to do with the nature of Iranian state and how it is has been trying for the past 3 decades to shape its citizens according to certain notion of truth that the state thinks it projects. I come back to that issue, but I want to say that basically what I will try to explain in my presentation is a more specific question than stating the obvious. The title of my talk is really stating the obvious. We know that social scientists and social sciences were on trial. I will come back to this very shortly. But the question is that why is it that social scientists are both arrested and harassed and targeted for participating in political activities, which we sort of understand, but also for studying the public sphere. And I think this is perhaps a little unique in the case of Iran that I would like to explain. So to go back to the original slide. And again, I want to repeat that these events were so important that Ayatollah Khamenei, who became the leader of Iran in 1980, for 20 years, he always tried not to be the front man on political disputes and not to be very public. I think for the first time during these events, he came and his associate claims that he managed the whole process of cracking down on the Green movement, and he had a very, very public presence on a daily basis, and of course the Revolutionary Guards and the security forces. In September of that year, 2009, he made a speech. He made many speeches. Because we don't have time, I just choose these quotes. By the way, I cannot quote him because, in fact, after in the post-election time, his office basically asked all the media not to quote him at all. This is something that is still going on. Only his office would send reports of his public speeches, and the press can only quote those reports and not his actual speeches. That's why I can't say what he said, because his office would say that our beloved leader, this is what he said, and they basically summarize what he said, which is another issue. Anyhow, there are three important points that he makes in this speech. One is that he is very concerned that there are 2 million Iranian youth who are majoring in human sciences or social sciences. Well, what is ironic about this statement is that these are mainly, or I would say exclusively, state universities. These are not Iranian students who are majoring in human sciences in London and New York. And these are professors who have gone through a very complicated process of being hired and making sure that they all believe in Islam and the ideology of the states, and they behave according to very complicated rules that Iranian universities have. Right? However, it also makes a very empirical statement, that is that for the first time, it seems, in Iran, social sciences have become popular at a very mass level. 2 million of Iranians. I will give you a brief history of these academic disciplines a little later, and you realize that this is pretty unique. The other 2 points he makes is, one, that human sciences are copies of Western ideas, and what they do is that they lead to doubts and mistrusts of the principles of Islam. And his second point is that human sciences, which is basically, he is basically again stating the obvious, that social sciences do not conform to state ideology. Secondly, his last point is that is a ridiculous propaganda that social sciences see humans as animals, and basically that there is something ethically or morally wrong with social sciences. I will come back to some of this, but it's important to say this. So remember that now the entire Islamic Republic states and its institutions and resources are mobilized to deal with these fitna, and in that context to show the true face of human sciences. I want to talk to you only about 2 events that is relevant to my talk. One is what happened in August. Remember, the elections happened in June. There was mass arrests of thousands of Iranians, and in August there was what it's known as mass show trials. Basically, hundreds of Iranians who were arrested were brought into a large auditorium, probably larger than this space here, and were forced to confess, to confessions. So two things were very important, and I would say that, if someone like me, who I think I know what's going on in Iran, I was totally puzzled by listening to the prosecution indictments. It had very little to say about the crimes that the people who were arrested made. It started with a discussion of certain sociologists, many of them, say like Max Weber, who died in 1921, Talcott Parsons, and then some contemporaries, including Habermas and Richard Rorty, and so on and so on, feminism, post-structuralism, postmodernism. So it was a very surreal prosecution indictment document. I think it's unique in history of humankind, probably. Although I don't know, maybe during the 30s under Stalin, there were these things too, and there are similarities. The individual you see here, Saeed Hajjarian, is a very fascinating personality in Iran. This is a guy who was a young college student during the revolution, 78-79. He was an engineering student at Tehran University, became active in the revolution, and later basically led the effort to create the information ministry, which is sort of, in the American context, is a massive state ministry that does what both CIA and FBI does. It's basically the main security forces in Iran. But he became disillusioned, which I talk a little later about, and left the engineering school, and in fact enrolled in the Faculty of Law and Political Science, and received a PhD in political science. And he, depending on your political view, he was either credited for or blamed for for coming up for a strategy that led to the reform movement and presidency of Mr. Khatami in 1997. Hajjarian was basically widely credited for engineering that election. And exactly because of that, a couple of years after Khatami became president, some right-wing groups targeted him, and he was assassinated. He was shot on the face, several shots on the face, and he was paralyzed. I have met him several times. He is doing a little okay, or at the time that I was meeting him, but he can't walk. Maybe he can make 2-3 steps, but that's all. He can probably talk for 2 or 3 minutes, but that's all. He cannot even sit. When I first time met him in his office, there is a bed. He can sit and talk to you for 5 minutes, then he has to lay down. I'm saying all this to say that certainly he wasn't on the street demonstrating. He was arrested very early on and was brought in by help. And intentionally him, a person who can't hardly walk. And although the trials were mass trials of hundreds of people, he was particularly asked to make the forced confessions. In fact, basically, the documents that, according to the state, he wrote, he couldn't read, so they asked another poor, younger prisoner to read that, was a summary of This is absolutely interesting because it seems, from my perspective, that the prosecution office did this in a very rushed way. Basically, it's a summary of the indictment. All the names that were early on mentioned and blamed for the upheaval in Iran, those names, Parsons, with focus on Weber, because Heideggerian has written about Weber, and Rorty and Habermas and John Kane and others. He basically he gave a summary of what the prosecution said. At the same time, being a very smart person, I think he did two things that are very important. One is that he basically said that what is wrong with social sciences is that it does not agree with the official ideology of the regime. You see this? So in a sense, this is not really a critique, or you can say this is both a critique but also complementing the social sciences for being the dissident voice. The poor Heideggerian was later, also after the show trials, was forced to go on TV and make forced confessions too, as a dialogue where he repeated some of this stuff. Right? So I'm saying all these things to say that this was not an accident, this was not a sort of so-called totalitarian states blaming everyone for what is going wrong. It was systematic, it was massive, it was organized, and it continued for at least 4 years, if not, well, actually, even it's going on right now. Okay, so in fact, scholars in the West have written about the attack on human science, social sciences. My colleague in the US, Charlie Kurtzman, has written about this, and others have written, and there has been lots of discussion of this. But I hope I can humbly say that I think most of the discussion on the issue is simplistic, and I wouldn't say wrong because they tell some part of the truth, but it fits into the stereotypical discussion that we usually have of dictatorial, totalitarian states basically not tolerating dissent or freedom of speech, which certainly is part of what was going and is going on in Iran. But my argument is that there is something more powerful and meaningful and important going on in Iran, and in a sense, this is not a senseless dictatorial state going mad and just arresting people randomly and making them to confess, like, for instance, what happened in the 30s in Soviet Union. This is much more meaningful and important and specific to the case of Iran and the Islamic Republic. But now, so I want to now step back a little, give you some introductions to sort of Iranian academic intellectual history, very briefly, of course, and then come back. Is that okay? Okay. So, as I said, and I am a little simplifying the discussion because I cannot go into all these complicated issues at the same time, is that the two departments or the two, when you know, of course, when we say social sciences, these are all, it's not clear what social sciences are, but in Iran, the two main academic disciplines and institutions that are targeted are one, political science, the other one, sociology. Sociology actually historically came to Iran very late, very, very late. The first sociology course in Iran was offered in the 40s by a very prominent politician who studied in France and sort of studied sociology, but also studied education, religion, so on and so forth. But a very prominent politician, somebody who under Mossadegh's premiership was the interior minister, a very important person, Sadeghi. But there was no sociology as a discipline. Dr. Sadeghi was teaching in the literature department, and in fact his approach was very literary. There is no time to discuss that. It's a very fascinating issue of how these academic disciplines at the local level are adopted. But the main sociological program in Iran was established with the help of Sadeghi and another French-educated sociologist, Ehsan Naraghi, in the 60s. And it wasn't until 1972 that the Faculty of Social Sciences was established in Iran. So sociology doesn't have a long history in Iran, and I know that some of you here have studied in this department, so forgive me to saying this, but never enjoyed a very high status in Iranian academic life. In fact, I went to Faculty of Law and Political Science, actually, that I come back and discuss. And at the time, we felt that the losers would go to sociology. And in fact, for me, it was a safety choice, right? The very last one was sociology. And when I took the entrance exam. So I'm saying all this to say that it's not that historically sociology has enjoyed either a huge reputation or has huge resources or popularity in Iran. Never up to the revolution. Political science, on the other hand, both has a very long history in Iran. The School of Political Science, Madrasa Ulum Siyasi, was established in late 19th century, even before the School of Law, and then later it was merged with the School of Law, and still it is basically Faculty of Law and Political Science. When I went there in the 70s, that was how it was. For a brief period of time, the economics was part of it, and then it separated. But political science, until recently, was really the diplomatic academy. When it was established, it was run by the foreign ministry. And of course, prominent people like Muhammad Ali Foroughi, who was a very well-known prime minister in Iran, and Ali Akbar Dehkhoda, a very, very, very well-known academic and cultural figures, were deans of this school. So in the humanities and social sciences, political science always enjoyed a very high prestige in Iran, but not necessarily known for being an intellectual center. Until late 60s, when Hamid Enayat, who was my mentor, and who actually, by the way, studied an LSE, got a master's in political science here, but got his PhD from SOAS, went back and was chair of the department, and with the help of others, made political science a major intellectual center. And also many of the future leaders of the Islamic movement, political Islam, whatever you want to call it, the movement that led to revolutions, came from actually this department. Many of them, including the leader of Mujahideen, Rajavi, many in the leaderships of the Islamic Republic, and so on and so on. There is no time for me to go into this, but that. Now, one more historical issue, and then I want to get into the discussing, going back to the earlier discussions. So up to the revolutions, basically, the intellectual environment in Iran in the 60s and 70s were dominated by two trends. I am simplifying a little, but since I consider myself an intellectual historian of Iran and have written books about these things, I think you can sort of trust me if you know what I'm saying. That this is it is. The main intellectual discourse in Iran was organized around this notion of Westoxication, which is it's a Heideggerian reading of Iranian situation, and basically it's a critique of what was going on under the Pahlavis, of the modernization, westernization. It's a critique of modernity. Or I know that some of the people who were involved would tell me this is Edward Said before there was Edward Said. Jalal Ahmad's book, Westoxication, was probably the most important political intellectual documents when I was in high school and at college. And of course, the idea comes from Heidegger and this Iranian Heideggerian Fardid, but was popularized by the Al-Ahmad, whose picture is here. But the discussion, this group of people were mainly philosophers. Some of them were literary figures. Many of them were scholars of Islam and religion. But there were others too. And they were mainly, in terms of Western figures, influenced by two philosophers, Heidegger and Henry Corbin, Henry Corbin was basically French Heideggerian, so you see the connection. What is interesting about this group of intellectuals is that they were very hostile to sociology. There is no time to go into this, but every occasion they had a chance in their books, their speeches, and their talks, they would express their hostility and critique of sociology, and they basically saw sociology as the manifestation of Westoxication, meaning really humanism and politically the West, and liberalism and democracy and so on and so forth. These groups were more elitist intellectual groups and very prominent, but there was another trend of, I would say, more popular and more socially based leftist intellectuals. And these were mostly, although there are exceptions, literary figures, poets and novelists and essayists and artists. And almost all of them were influenced by Marxism and what I call third world cosmopolitanism, particularly the attention to the third world literature and a struggle for justice and so on and so forth. But and some of the main prominent literary figures of Iran were among them. And there was very little connections between the two. In terms of ideas, there was one, that was the Westoxication. Both groups sort of were very anti-Western. Now, so that's the context. When you look at the context, we see that the hostility towards social sciences actually comes from certain trends even before the revolution, and but even the groups of literary intellectuals and leftist intellectuals who were not necessarily hostile to social sciences were not social scientists and didn't that much care for social sciences. Even that includes Marxist intellectuals. There are some exceptions, but not much. 10 minutes. Okay. Now, a year before the controversial elections of 2009, I was working in Iran and interviewing people, doing field work on the question that relates to my talk today. And my what I was interested in those days was that what were the underlying reasons for a massive ideological change, transformation, that went on in Iran by a rather large group of Muslim activists, intellectuals, and young, basically, activists who participated in the 78, 79 revolution, were part of the government. They were utopian, radical leftists, and then they changed, and later they formed what we now call the reform movement, or they led the democratic movement in Iran. I want to just highlight 5 of these. I would go quickly because there are lots of things I want to say, and I don't want to not be able to do this. So these were prominent figures. Tayzadeh still is in prison, a very important figure. Tayzadeh also got a PhD from the Faculty of Law and Political Science. Khanaki had a PhD from the Sociology Department. Reza Tehrani is the only one among them who doesn't have a PhD, and Abdi also studied sociology. Unfortunately, I wish I had time to talk to you about those biographies, but I don't. I just want to summarize what happened in my conversations with them. And I want to just briefly, basically, touch on 2 areas that are pertinent to our today's talk. I basically asked them through a series of questions that what was in their mind during the revolutions? What ideologies, ideas, personalities influenced them when they were young and they were active as radical Muslim, radical revolutionaries. What is interesting, still I have to really talk briefly about this, is that what they told me is that, well, they were influenced by Ali Shariati, who, a Muslim intellectual who studied in Sorbonne, very much mixed up certain notion of Islam that he had with Marxism, but also was influenced by Henry Corbin and Heidegger too, a sort of existentialist, Marxist. When I say Marxism, not materialism, but dialectic, the whole idea of philosophy of history, Hegelianism, and Muslim activists, and among the most radical one being Mujahideen, and basically, and of course the charismatic leadership of Khomeini. Khomeini as a leader who knows, who they trust and they can follow, and the ideology as a sort of utopian radical ideology that basically, if I want to simplify it, that can be summarized as the following: that there is a moral crisis in Iran. This is under the Shah, and the crisis is the crisis of the state, because they saw the state through Shariati and Marxism and many other things, that the state as moral agent. So if the state is the moral agent, the state is either corrupt or is sources of our salvation. That's how they became revolutionaries. They became revolutionaries in a sense that they wanted to overthrow the Shah's government, a corrupt state, and they wanted to establish Islamic State. An Islamic State for them, according to my interviews with these folks, is a moral agent to bring in human dignity. Although the way they talk about it is more utopian than. So I asked them what happened after the revolution. So the revolution happens, these folks won the revolution. Of course, they all became part of the new states. But shortly after the revolution, there was the war, 8 years war with Iraq. And so, again, I'm quickly summarizing lots of issues here, is that what they said was that, in a sense, when they think about it now, that they feel that the war with Iraq gave them the opportunity to continue their revolutionary commitment. Right? Because now, for them, the state, the moral agent, that which represented everything that they believe in, was in danger. And they were also, it's a violent exercise, it's a war. And they were all involved in the war. And what war offered them was a second reality. Of course, there was another reality going on in Iran. Right? During the 8 years of war with Iraq, the Islamic Republic was engaged in a very brutal battle, both within the states and with the forces, leftists, Marxists, and others, and minorities. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed in the process, and lots of atrocities were committed. But what these intellectuals tell me is that although at the time they were sort of aware of what was happening, but the war was the reality. And the war superimposed itself to their mind, so that one of these folks told me that we saw the other reality as a shadow reality. Right? It was in the background what the regime did, all of these things that I am putting here, of the brutal way that the regime dealt with the opposition, the way that the Montazeri affairs, the way that they did with Ayatollah Montazeri, a very respected person among them, and so on and so forth. They didn't pay attention to any of those things because the war was going on and everything seems justified. And they believe in the leadership, the leader, the imam, the guide. However, when Ayatollah Khomeini accepted the peace deal that he had rejected, and as a result, hundreds of thousands of Iranians were killed, and to these individuals that I interviewed, it seemed that, to quote them, we accepted a defeat. And everything at this point was questioned. Certainly, Gharbzadegi, the poor guy who is still in prison, told me that the entire aura of charismatic aura around the Imam collapsed. Others said, well, we realized that perhaps our reality was a shadow reality, and this other reality were more real. In other words, maybe the state is source of lies and not a moral agent. Right? So the moment of disillusionments, the moment of change, contrary to many books and scholarly works that has been written, was not that their attitudes toward Islam changed, or they got to know the West better, or any of those issues. Was a very existential, experiential moment in their life. That moment obviously started with the war, right? Now, what is interesting is that almost all of these folks after the war, they basically stepped down from whatever government jobs they had. They all, without exception, these groups, but I know this to be true of larger groups, they all went to the Department of Social Sciences and studied political science, sociology, and similar fields.
2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, and I probably have half an hour.
Okay.
Let me respect our very kind chair. Well, I now want to just give you an outline of my main theoretical argument. My theoretical, well, so I can't finish that story, but what I want to tell you is that what happened as a result of this disillusionment in the post-war era was a major shift in intellectual and public discourse. From this early Westoxication, ontological, identity basically based ideology, to believing in ideas in the public sphere. and also talking about those ideas. By the way, when you look at the literature, it is only in the context of the reform movement these ideas of become important. And again, it's not by accident. Most of these folks and other folks went to these two departments, studied under particular professors that are blamed, and they also studied Weber and Habermas and some of those, John Kane and others, that the prosecution indictment mentioned. I have one more argument to make. Would you allow me?
Yes, please. Good.
Oh, okay. So what I want to say is that, okay, the only thing I want to talk is this. I want to conclude with this, that what came out of this new intellectual movement was, they put it to me as modesty of thought. I wish I had time to discuss this. I don't have, but let me try to do my best. Is that what these 5 individuals that I interviewed told me was that before they get to know social sciences and studies more systematically, and in the aftermath of the total disillusion with the leadership, they thought that there are values and ideas, and being radical and revolutionary means that you go and make and shape the reality the way you want to, or your values dictates. Studying people like Weber and Habermas and others, and for instance some Iranians, Bashiriye, who was a professor at Faculty of Law and Political Science, Huma Khatouzian, who is here at Oxford, they invited him and he gave lectures. They realized that respect for human dignity requires a distinction between, as I think I say here or in the previous one, is it's not to confuse, as Weber says, as a sociologist we know that, between the statement of policy and value and empirical reality. Or not to confuse the statement of law, Sharia, what they believe in, and the facts. And this is, I'm simplifying it and rushing it a little, but this is basically, this brings me to this slide. In another time, in the 30s and 40s, in Europe, there was very similar intellectual debates. Although it wasn't just an intellectual debate, it was a massive social political upheaval going on. It was when we were witnessing the rise of Nazism and Stalinism, and there was a huge debate among intellectuals on where to go. And all of these intellectuals were the left. Remember, the intellectuals that I interviewed are known in Iran as Islamic left. These were leftists too. So these are people who were critical of liberalism. They never believed in objective reality or enlightenment, the idea of enlightenment universalism. But we see these two figures here, Michael Polanyi and Alexander Kobier, who, because of the biological, their personal experiences, but their biographies, because they were Jewish, they were Eastern Europeans, and they experienced prisons, they had similar experience that these individuals that I interviewed had. And they were leftists, and at the time, even communists. They, so in the 30s and 40s, something similar to what is happening in Iran, I believe, did happen. And the end result is amazingly similar. That, for instance, here I want to just focus on Kobier's idea of the humbling of everyday reflections. Is that both of these two Michael Polanyi as well, whose older brother, Karl Polanyi, is more well known probably among sociologists. These were the ones who said, well, totalitarian states, of course, they meant either Stalinism or fascism at the time, represents basically what they call the modern law, right? I finished. Right? And but the opposite of lie is not truth. There is no total truth, right? The opposite of truth is not falsehood. The opposite of lie is believing in human dignity and believing in the multi-centeredness of the truth in the public sphere. Again, I don't have time to go into that, but and I'm sure some of you know this better than I do, but when I compare what happened in the 30s and 40s, and the main piece I want to focus on is really this piece by Alexandre Corvier on political function of modern law. By the way, we had this in the US in the aftermath of the Iraq War, that is massive production of laws by the state to shape the citizens as a mirror image of those laws. I think that is what the Islamic Republic is, and that is what social sciences, broadly speaking, not as a discipline or academic things, represents in Iran, and that's why the Ayatollah Khamenei feels threatened and concerned about it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for this lecture. Perhaps in the Q&A session we can tease out some of the theoretical and political issues that are at stake here. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand and a microphone will come your way. Yes. And I urge you to pose questions rather than making statements, if that's possible. Yes.
Hello. I was just going to ask you about what happened actually after the Iran-Iraq war, which that there was the large baby boom which took place, which resulted in mothers being encouraged to have a lot of children after the Iran-Iraq war to create a new generation of Iranians, and then leading to a lot of them living in poverty. And I think that's led to quite a large sort of resentment of the regime among the old regime among the young generation. Do you think that has anything to do with the sort of the shift which is taking place in Iran, especially sort of recently with the election of Rouhani, who is seen as moderate by Iranian standards?
Okay, I'll take a few more questions, if that's all right. Yes, please.
Hello, Salam, Khwasin. The one I firstly really loved everything you said. I thought that you missed a few people out, like Mansour Hekmat, and I wasn't too sure why Shariati's name was right next to Mujahideen when Shariati and Khomeini were on the bullet points. But my question is, do you think that, given that you said that political function of modern lie and it takes a reflection of the state, do you think that that's basically been a long-running trend since maybe, going back to the time of Reza Shah, or even let's go back to the Qajars, because the things you were talking about forced recantations, which Abrahamian also made reference to, I see that like Pahlavi Iran and the Islamic Republic have kind of got quite a heavy similarity with regards to focusing on these lies and making people believe that they're living in the state and so forth. So just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions in the house? Yes, you in the middle, please. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I want to know I want to know your idea. I think that the existence of such political thinkers like Heideggerian or the people that you mentioned, it's the main reason that Islamic Republic survived until now, and I think it is the main reason that it's going to survive, I think, in a long time in future. The fact that these people were able to go to at least somehow social science faculty and the fact that this faculty didn't has survived after revolution, it shows that this government has capacity to accept Western ideas.
Mm-hmm. Any questions? Yes, you please. Okay, and after this, we should take a moment to respond, and yes. I'll collect more questions later.
I was just wondering, this Khamenei saying that human science is based on materialistic philosophy and is animal, was something to do that animals don't have a spiritual. It's not a spiritualistic, like religion being spiritual. Mm-hmm. And whether that's what he meant by saying is animalistic.
Sure. Would you like to?
Yeah, but I'm not sure if I understand the first question clearly.
I was just wondering whether you thought that because of the baby boom, which led a lot of people into poverty, and the sort of generation which are growing up now, that's the reason why the generation growing up now is so resentful of the current regime, and whether that has something to do with the recent shift in Iran towards someone such as Rouhani, who is moderate.
Thank you.
Well, no, I don't think so. I think my argument here is that there has been for a long time a pretty large-scale organized movement for openness in Iran, and there are social reasons, socioeconomic reasons, cultural reasons, intellectuals involved. But in the book that I published just before the Green Movement, that is the argument that I make in my book on democracy in Iran. So it cannot be explained through fertility rates and generational divides. So that's that. The second question, I actually do not believe that I didn't have time, and probably we don't have time to go into what the political function of modern law is, but the two prerequisites of what is referred to as totalitarian states, or what we now call ideological states, is that one is that a massive production of lies. So this is not a state official lying, which we are all used to it, but a massive production of lie in a way that it permeates people's everyday life. I personally experienced that in the US at the beginning of the war with Iraq, that I felt that everything on TV, New York Times that I read every morning, everything that the state produced, there was this sort of like reign of terror, but they were lies. There was no, I didn't feel terrorized physically, but I felt that everything has been mobilized. And in that context, I think Islamic Republic has that. And the ability through Friday prayers and through massive infrastructure of national radio and TV to produce that. And they want to produce Islamic citizens according to the mirror image of those that lie. Or the lie is really also the truth. What we are talking about is not lie, the opposite of truth, but is one dogmatic idea of truth. Pahlavi state totally lacked that. Pahlavi state was not interested in that. Pahlavi state was interested in basically controlling population, one, through offering development, and secondly, through police and security forces. Mm-hmm. And the last question, I partly agree with you. That's why I do not use the term totalitarian state for Islamic Republic. There are spaces within the system of Islamic Republic where people can voice their views. For instance, elections are taken seriously. Remember, this whole green movement came out of an election movement. You don't usually in totalitarian states, you have those things. All these individuals are Muslims who also believed in Islamic Republic and the leadership. So I feel that, yes, there is that space. But at the same time, this space also they have their own dynamism. They have their own way of producing other kind of truth, other ideas. And in a sense that there is a sort of impasse that Islamic Republic has to decide either to go, say, serious way, become a total police state, or has to reconcile with the tensions that it preoccupies them. And last question is that this issue of human sciences and animal things is totally propaganda. I know many of these individuals. These are as pious Muslims as Ayatollah Khamenei. These are, because they study Weber doesn't mean that they have converted to Protestantism or to secularism. These are not secular individuals. These are basically part of that production of massive lies. These people, I know Gharbzadegi, who the poor guy still is in prison after 5 years. He is a devoted Muslim as any Muslim is. Remember, this conflict was basically among two factions within the Islamic Republic. This was not between Weber and Talgut Parsons and Ayatollah Khamenei.
Okay. A few more questions I think we can take. One in the middle, then in the back, and then, yes.
Hi. You know that Karl Popper is extremely popular among the reformists. Is that an accident, you think?
Thank you.
Well, two very briefly. Yeah. One, I think the popularity of Karl Popper is exaggerated. There is no time to go into that. Secondly, I agree, but for the same reason, because Karl Popper is important in the West because he's a critique of Western European totalitarianism, right? And he's a philosopher of science. Remember, these two, both Michael Polanyi and Alexandre Courrier are also philosophers or historians of science. And yes, it's not by accident, because he is also part of revealing this sort of, or making argument against this massive production of lies. So it's not by accident, although I think his role is a little exaggerated, at least as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, I'll take two questions together, in the back and then here. Did the person in the back leave? Oh, you're there. Okay. You can go first, please. Yes, in the back.
What is the social science perspective in Iran regarding other schools of Islam that surround them towards the east?
Did you understand the question? Could you repeat that, please? A little loud. Thank you.
What is the Iranian social science thought on the Wahhabi movements such as the Taliban and Pakistan, which are neighbouring states that they will have to deal with in the coming years? Is there a position on this?
Okay.
Or is it unclear?
Thank you for repeating. Let me take another question and then you could respond. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to know, if possible, where history fits in, the study of history. Would that be included as a social science? And if so, or even if not, is there any state intervention in the teaching of the history, as the gentleman suggested earlier, about the past and the continuity of the past from the Pahlavi and Qajars and Safavids and so forth? Is there any sort of official state view, and if somebody says something different, like a disruptive discourse or something, would they intervene?
Okay, and the last question, I think we have only time for one more question. you haven't asked yet, have you? No, please.
Thank you for your presentation. I think one of the most important things that we should consider is in Iran, the government controls the universities. So I believe that the quality of teaching has been changed in recent years, especially in social science, and the government tries to just put someone who are agreed with their policies as a lecturer in the university. So what do you think about the quality of teaching in recent years?
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Well, on Wahhabism, I didn't necessarily talk to this particular individual about Wahhabism, but I don't think they care about Wahhabism or Taliban. It is used by all sides as insult, so I don't think they care for that. History, I have to be a little specific here. The Iranian government, of course, would like to intervene in every area of academic life if they can, including history. But in this organized effort against certain academic discipline, I don't see any sensitivity toward history, and history has not. Nobody mentioned history or philosophy or literature. By the way, the most westernized academic disciplines in Iran are economics and management. I have actually visited these departments, and they basically, I think that in the US they teach probably less Western texts than they do in Iran, and nobody has raised any issues on those areas. In fact, neoliberalism is probably the dominant school of thought in economics, and I have never ever seen anybody within a state. I have seen some leftists criticizing them, but nobody within the state criticizing them. No, the really focus are these two areas. And government control, I actually think this is a little more complicated, because it is true that all these universities are, particularly these two departments, are controlled and run by the government. But it is not true that they can control everything. And again, they have fired professors, they have expelled students, but every 5 years or so, we have a situation where the state feels that they have no control over the universities. So it's more complicated, and I think there are some spaces, and universities are. On the last part of your question, there is no quality, really. What is ironic about this huge effort against social sciences is that social sciences in Iran is extremely weak in terms of research, in terms of curriculum, in terms of resources that these departments have. It just seems that they are a huge force only because of this attack by the states. But no, it's extremely weak, and particularly since 2009, there is very little going on in terms of what we call academic research.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Mirsepassi for the lecture and the Q&A. We can carry on the conversation. There is a reception outside, and the audience is welcome. Everybody is welcome. So let's carry the conversation over. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you.